I could not live without, oh my gosh.
3 kisses, good morning, babe. It's always 3.
I love reading and writing. Very happy endings.
Music, I believe there's some God in it.
My dog is another thing that brings me joy. I call her Cookie.
I could not live without love. More importantly, respect.
I'm a woman just like you.
I am a man.
A human.
Just like you.
Only my journey was a little different than yours.
Good afternoon. I'm Jay Brown, Senior Vice President of Programs, Research, and Training at the Human Rights Campaign. And on behalf of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights and the Human Rights Campaign, I'd like to welcome you to today's discussion, celebrating and defending trans lives in the classroom and beyond. First, some light housekeeping. Feel free to drop in some affirming comments or questions that you'd like us to address in the chat. We'll try to incorporate them into the discussion today as best we can. And we'd like to open with a message from Carrie Kennedy, President of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights.
Hi, I'm Carrie Kennedy, President of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. For more than 50 years, our organization has partnered with the bravest people on earth, human rights defenders around the globe. Today, we are proud to partner with our fellow advocates at Human Rights Campaign, the nation's largest LGBTQ civil rights group. In honor of Transgender Day of Visibility, we've created a trans rights lesson plan to equip and engage students on how to become better allies of the LGBTQ community. The lesson celebrates the stories of trans and non-binary activists, actors, students, and athletes, reinforcing the innate human rights we all have to live freely and with dignity as our authentic selves. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie, for this wonderful and meaningful partnership. And now I'd like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves. First, we'll start with Tori. Tori, can you introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, Jay. My name is Tori Cooper, and I'm the Director of Community Engagement for the Transgender Justice Initiative. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm really excited to be here today.
Thank you, Tori. Then Gavin. Gavin, come on up.
Hello, Jay. Good evening. Nice to see everybody here. My name is Gavin Grimm. I'm a client of the ACLU in a lawsuit filed in 2015 against my school board when they banned me from using the boys' bathroom because I'm trans, and I currently serve as a member of the Executive Board of Directors at the ACLU. Thank you very much.
It's so good to have you today here, Gavin. Thanks for coming. And then Laura.
Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Osterndorf, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the training manager for the Speak Truth to Power team at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, and I oversee the creation, implementation, and evaluations of our trainings and lesson plans for the Human Rights Education Program, which shows that everyone can make a difference to end and prevent human rights abuses, including human rights violations against our transgender and non-binary family and friends.
Thank you, Laura. So appreciate your work. And Jessica.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Cortez. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a Stony Brook University social work candidate, master, and I'm also interning for the Human Rights Speak to Power team with the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization. Thank you.
It's so good to have you here, Jessica. Thank you all for coming. I'm thrilled to be here with you all today, having a great discussion. As many of our viewers know, and certainly all of you know, this past Wednesday was Trans Day of Visibility. It's a time earmarked every year to celebrate trans and non-binary lives. You know, this year we have a lot to celebrate, and the political landscape has made it a difficult time to celebrate, let alone protect trans lives. Lawmakers in more than 24 states, half the state legislatures in the US, are actively working to restrict or outright eliminate rights for trans people, targeting especially transgender youth. You know, these bills are really solutions in search of a problem, and are another chapter in a long agenda by our opponents to undermine our human rights. Despite this reality, we know that public opinion is actually on our side and continues to grow on our side. In fact, we did a poll recently that found 73% of people believe, for example, that trans kids should be allowed to play on the team with which they feel the most comfortable, including 56% of Republicans. These kinds of support numbers are across a lot of the different issues that trans folks face. That said, this political rhetoric has a real impact on our lives. So I'd first like to start actually with you, Tori, and talk to you about the connections between anti-trans legislation and policymaking and the violence and stigma that trans people face. Can you speak a little bit more about the connection between stigma and violence? What do you say when you hear people claim to say they're not seeking to hurt us, that they're just trying to protect women and girls, for example?
So it's a ridiculous argument. And it is a ridiculous argument for a number of reasons. First of all, trans girls are girls, trans women are women, trans boys are boys. And so that's the first part of the fallacy behind that argument. And then it's really important to know that words matter. We're living in an environment and at a time now where, we just came out of an administration that is using words to defame people and seeks to really erase the existence of trans people and has spoken so harshly about people of Asian descent. And we see now what's going on across our country, in part because of those words and the rhetoric. There's action behind those words. And so when we're talking about youth and we're talking about the policy, the words that they're using that they say are there to protect us are actually creating larger chasms. They're further dividing us. They're dividing us because they're pitting one woman against another. They're saying that cisgender women are incapable of protecting themselves. So it is the responsibility of white heterosexual cisgender men who are in Congress to protect them and no one else. And so there's so much there. There's patriarchy that's involved with it, and that could be very, very dangerous. We live in a country where the systems that we navigate have not been kind to anyone other than the same folks who are creating these really ridiculous and divisive pieces of legislation. And they continue to fight, even though we now have the administration, the federal administration, a president and a vice president who represent the most affirming, LGBTQ affirming and trans affirming administration in the history of the country. And so regardless as to what your political affiliation is, regardless as to what your personal beliefs are about who trans people are and how we exist in this world, we have to understand that they're using rhetoric that further divides us because they know that there's strength in numbers. And when we join together, all women and all womanhood and all manhood and all personhood, that we're stronger when we work together. And that we have to use our collective voices to really fight wholeheartedly against the oppression that they would further put on all of us.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you, Tori. I think your comment, words matter, is so true. And it's something that we really do start at the youngest age trying to instill in our children. And that brings me to the lesson plan and the partnership with that between RFK and HRC on this work. Laura, can you, thinking a little bit more about the backdrop of what we're dealing with and the culture war that's even being brought to the classrooms across the country, what can educators do to not only explain these issues, but to protect and support students who might identify as trans or non-binary and be directly impacted by hearing words like these?
Yeah, thank you for that thoughtful question, Jay. And as you mentioned, we just launched our lesson plan that's all about celebrating and defending trans and non-binary lives. And that lesson plan features the stories of human rights activists, including Gavin on the panel with me, but also Minneapolis Councilwoman Andrea Jenkins, actress Laverne Cox, NCAA celebrated athlete Skylar Baylor, author Jacob Tobiah, and our RFK Young leaders. And I think all of that shows that there's no one trans experience or path to being our authentic selves. And I hope that the critical pedagogy and participatory exercises will help teachers and students to both unpack their own relationship with the gender binary, as well as recognize the United Nations human rights protections for trans and non-binary people. And our lesson ends with action plans to help all of us become better allies and co-conspirators with the LGBTQ community. So in this way, human rights education can be a really powerful vehicle to protect and support trans and non-binary students and everyone. But the instructional and curricular approaches that we use in schools can go a long way. So when you're incorporating positive messaging about trans and non-binary people in your curriculum, that should be every day of the year, not just on Transgender Day of Visibility. And that will help to decrease the previous erasure and stigmatization that may have been present in the past. So when we're thinking about the lessons in the books that we use, we really want to make sure that we're not only showing that trans folks exist, but that they should be celebrated for their accomplishments throughout history. In our lesson, there is a really great plan for welcoming schools that shows that trans and gender nonconforming women have always participated throughout history, including with the Stonewall Inn movement and the modern LGBTQ movement. And we hope that both of these stories will serve as mirrors for students who see themselves reflected and positively affirmed by the material, but they also serve as windows so that other students can understand experiences outside their own and engage with different identities. So overall, reading books by and about trans and non-binary people, as well as engaging in lessons that challenge gender stereotypes, are incredibly important. But I think that we can take other steps as well. So, in some of those classes like math and science, I hope that we can take steps towards allyship by using they, them pronouns and pronouns outside the binary. And we can also consider the hidden messaging that's in our curriculum. So as someone walks into our classes, we need to make sure they're seeing mixed gender or gender neutral groups, as well as decorations and imagery that reflect the family diversity and support for the LGBTQ community that I know we all have. Beyond the curriculum, I also want to say that in the lesson plan, we talk about how when you witness misgendering, gender stereotyping, alienating, or bullying language, it's really important that you interrupt that as it goes on, intervene, and address the harassment immediately. You need to name the behavior and say, this was derogatory or discriminatory, and help with that understanding that's going to lead to learning and reconciliation. At the same time, support the person who was the target of that language, listen to them without making assumptions, and ask them what they need or want, whether that should be provided publicly or privately. And of course, we're always going to honor the pronouns and the names that students use and avoid putting our trans or gender expansive students in the position where they should be teaching others. So these types of actions, as far as inclusive conversations, as well as curriculum efforts, are really powerful to help our teachers create gender inclusive schools where everyone feels safe, valued, and dignified to be their authentic self.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I appreciate you raising Welcoming Schools, which is a program of the Human Rights Campaign, and we have a lot of resources on that site around supporting trans and non-binary students as well. And a lot of them are linked in this amazing lesson plan. One of the things that we do through that program actually is a National Day of Reading, Jazz and Friends, where folks in classrooms, libraries, wherever, read stories about trans and non-binary experiences to young people. And I know as a trans man how much that would have meant to me as a young person to sort of see myself reflected in the stories that my teachers are reading in the classroom. So I'm thrilled that this lesson plan does raise the importance of that. And it really brings me to my next question, which is to you, Gavin. You've really experienced firsthand and have been such an incredible advocate. Really, just thank you for everything you've done, Gavin. But what it means to have to fight for your rights in school after repeated discrimination and harm, and becoming a political target in the process. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience and how it's inspired your activism today, and what teachers should know about supporting trans and non-binary students in their classrooms?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. When you are 15 and you have only just sort of come into yourself, accepted this part of yourself, you're settling into what for some people can be a very joyful experience of getting to have all these things happen for the first time. First time you get a necklace that has your name on it from the pre-made necklaces at some store, or the first time you have your name on a birthday cake. Ideally, trans people who have just come out and are just navigating the world as themselves should be able to experience these joys and these victories. But instead, I was 15 and I was having to beg my school to allow me to have a bathroom to use while I was there. to be in that area and in that environment, for it to be so conservative, it really seemed like a very dangerous thing to do. But it was even more dangerous to me to accept that that was how things were going to have to be, and for the rest of my high school career, been 3 full years out of 4 years of high school, accepting that I was just going to be discriminated against and essentially pushed into this separate space where I was away from my peers. Trans kids shouldn't have to worry about that. They shouldn't have to. In fact, when I approached my school at all, I approached them in a way where I was kind of seeking permission almost. Can I be me at school? You know, this is who I am, but can I be me? And kids should be marching up to the school saying, this is who I am.
Oh no, we lost Gavin. You there?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Oh, you scared me. Sorry about that. Kids should be able to walk up to school and say, this is who I am and this is what I deserve. And so that has absolutely informed me going forward in my mindset of how we should be building a future for our trans kids, where they don't have to ask permission to be themselves and be respected as themselves.
I so appreciate that. Thank you, Gavin. Laura, next question is for you. Jessica, I'm sorry. Jessica, question for you. First of all, you're a social worker, love social workers, make the world go round for real. And you're studying for your master's at Stony Brook. Social workers really can play a critical role in the movement for trans rights and have played a critical role. Can you tell us a little bit more about the connection between social work and LGBTQ rights, and how an enhanced understanding of human rights helps you better serve trans and non-binary youth?
Yes, thank you. And I want to thank first the Human Rights Campaign and the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization for this opportunity. I will begin by saying that social workers do play a critical role in the movement of transgender rights. The first question is, what is the connection between social work and LGBTQ rights? So a little history. In 2001, the International Federation of Social Workers and the International Association of Schools of Social Work declare principles of human rights and social justice are fundamental to social work. The global standards for the education and training of the social work profession translated this precept into a mandate for global social work education, asserting that all social work students must be schooled in basic human rights approach as reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the United States, the Council of Social Work Education, CSWE, followed this international directive when it introduced a new obligation for schools of social work to teach social work students how to advance human rights. Though social work and human rights have a long history of cooperation, these international mandates mark the beginning of a new era in which social work educators must teach towards competency in human rights advancement and advocacy. The NSW, or the National Association of Social Workers, supports the adaptation of human rights as a foundation principle upon which all of social work theory and applied knowledge rests. In a world where increasingly there's a serious questioning of the responsibility of society to ensure that people's civil, political, cultural, social, and economic needs are met, social workers should be absolutely clear about where they stand. Therefore, social workers have a shared commitment to promoting laws, policies, and programming that affirm, supports, and value transgender, non-binary, LGBTQ individuals, families, communities, and communities. The plight of the transgender LGBTQ individuals affected by recent policies provides another opportunity to speak up and act on behalf of this vulnerable population. Social workers are in the ideal position to fight for the protection and advancement of trans, non-binary, and LGBTQ rights because they serve on the front lines in many areas where those rights are being attacked. So the second question is, how does an enhanced understanding of human rights help us better serve trans and non-binary youth? First, we need to understand that trans, non-binary, and LGBTQ youth come from all walks of life. They are a diverse community representing all racial and ethnic backgrounds, as well as all faiths and traditions. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, every human is guaranteed inalienable human rights. For many trans youth, these rights exist only in form, not in substance. Trans youth are denied not only fundamental rights to equality, dignity, health, and security of being, but their very personhood. Trans people experience marginalization, discrimination, and violence. This debilitating environment has many harmful consequences. One of them, which is severe here in the United States, is homelessness in youth. An enhanced understanding of human rights will help us provide valuable and effective services at different levels of practice, at the micro level, at the meso level, and at the macro level. When I say macro, I'm talking at the clinical level, one-on-one with the client. At the meso level, I'm talking between the organizations. And then at the macro level, I'm talking in policy, in government. In addition, an important aspect of social work is education. Educating trans and non-binary youth about their human rights and how those rights are being violated empowers youth to advocate for themselves. Not only empowers them, but provides youth with a sense of community, a sense of belonging, and happiness. Again, an enhanced understanding of human rights helps us understand why we need to advocate for transgender inclusive policies. For example, basic equality for all within health and social services agencies. Agencies often operate as social microcosm that focus on providing services with historical roots steeped in charity, the traditional band-aid approach, rather than justice for our clients. A human rights approach can help agencies identify and amend the social injustices that have inhibited transgender workplace protection. An enhanced understanding of civil and political human rights help us to create coalitions with leading advocacy organizations such as the Human Rights Campaign and the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization to focus on political and civil liberties for transgender, non-binary, and LGBTQ community. By joining coalitions, organizations can stay more informed about the state of policy affecting transgender individuals, such as the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. Finally, social workers and social justice professionals play a critical role in the movement of transgender rights towards a fundamental version of social justice. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Love it. And I loved your comment about charity versus actual justice. So I really appreciate that. I want to follow up a little bit more around the lesson plan itself. And Laura, what are some of the barriers that you all face bringing human rights education, let alone trans rights education specifically, into the classrooms?
Sure. So I can touch on some of the barriers, and then I'll talk about how human rights education, including and especially trans rights education, can help in classrooms. So one of the common barriers that we hear are that teachers are resistant to implementing human rights education because they already have an overloaded curriculum and their students are prepping for exams. And I completely get that teachers are busy always, especially during a global pandemic. But we wanted to point out that studies show that child-centered and participatory teaching, as well as learning practices associated with human rights education, can actually help to improve the effectiveness of students within the national education system because they're developing those analytical and critical thinking skills that help them to be empowered learners. Another constraint that we hear is that there's a lack of training or knowledge because even when schools adopt Title IX, there's inadequate education for teachers about transgender identity, which can be a hindrance to enforcement. So in order to build educator capacity, it's really critical that we arrange for transgender awareness training for staff and administrators. And I consider myself a lifelong learner. I think that many teachers do. And that's why it's important that we seek professional development to ensure that we're providing the most inclusive and accurate terminology and practices in schools to make our students feel safe. And I think that finally, one of the last big concerns that we hear that folks are worried about community opposition. And a lot of times when legislators and community groups object to the inclusive education policies associated with human rights education, a lot of those ideas are actually rooted in fear and misinformation. And there's a chance that if they don't implement those inclusive policies, there's a greater chance of dysfunctional school environment overall, negative consequences, including student lack of interest in school, a heightened risk for alcohol and drug abuse, and poor mental health. But in comparison, when human rights and gender inclusive schools create that welcoming environment, there's a lot of great factors like non-discrimination, diversity, equal opportunity that lead to a decrease in bullying and conflict, and a place where all students and teachers feel physically and emotionally safe, and students become better learners. So I wanted to plug again that the Human Rights Campaign and Welcoming Schools have great resources on supporting LGBTQ and gender inclusive schools, from administrative policies on gender neutral facilities to cultivating good communication with parents and community members. And in areas where that has been done, trans rights education with supportive educators, gay-straight alliances, and anti-harassment policies have resulted in decreased absenteeism, decreased bullying and harassment overall, as well as a much better environment with empathetic citizenry for all students. So I think as this administration exists and the call for democratic education becomes more common, we want to ensure that human rights education and trans rights education is included within that. So within the lesson plan, we point to the Human Rights Campaign Blueprint for Positive Change, which includes recommendations to advance policies for the lives of LGBTQ Americans, and that includes inclusive education policy for schools. And gaining support for those policies, as well as human rights education in general, can only result in an amazing step forward to encouraging human rights in schools for all.
I appreciate that so much. I think we've seen, educators and administrators see pushback on everything from bringing the amazing 1619 project by Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times to their classrooms, to teaching lesson plans around LGBTQ inclusion. And sadly, I think, this has a real devastating effect on young people, not just folks who are young people who are marginalized, but folks who aren't and need to learn to live in a world with differences. So I am thrilled that this new administration is here, and I think even through our Welcoming Schools program, we're seeing more and more educators and administrators say, listen, we have the backing of a Department of Education that believes in the fundamental virtues of human rights in the classroom and will defend it. So I'm thrilled at the progress, and I think more tools like the lesson plan that we did together are going to be coming for folks to use, and we'll get into the hands of folks who need them. Really appreciate our partnership on this. Speaking of, Gavin, can you talk a little bit more about your life and advocacy for trans rights, and what does it mean for you as a role model for learning in schools? This sort of the work that we're talking about today.
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of sort of my life and what things look like at this point with my involvement in that portion of the community, I speak to the virus has changed a lot of stuff for a lot of people, but in general, I was very involved with going into schools and connecting with students and showing people who trans people are, or at least who I am as a trans person, and introducing people to the trans community at large, but also introducing people to the idea that as trans people, there are certain things that we just fundamentally deserve. We deserve inclusive language, we deserve inclusive policies. We are sort of past this point of visibility in the sense that, we're here and you see us, but we need work, we need support, we need actual tangible things in our corner. And so I kind of introduced the concept in these schools that yes, trans people are people, and this is who we are, and this is wonderful, but also there's work to be done. And so thinking about me as that 15-year-old kid who was just a trans kid who just wanted to live his life, and then all of a sudden the school board said, no, actually we're going to single you out for this harassment discrimination. I'm almost 22 now. It is unfathomable for me at this point, even though I went through this situation, to think about any child being in any similar position in school where they go and they say, this is who I am. And the response is that there is something wrong with you. You have to be separated from your peers. To be faced with that kind of ignorance and rejection. And so to know that my case, my court case, or something that I've done personally in my advocacy or something like that has had any kind of positive impact in any way, especially in the world of education. And when you talk about education, I think it's important to mention too that my career goal is to become a English teacher. I'm going to either start in middle school or high school. I guess we'll see which one. So for many reasons, this matter of trans education and inclusivity is so close to my heart and so important to me. And I just think that if I can, if I can be part of this wonderful community that has these resources and these people that are ready to go and ready to take the world by storm and share the message of trans love and trans joy and education, if I can just be a little tiny part of that, I think it's so wonderful. And to hear feedback that anything that I've done at all has changed anything for anyone in any little positive way, just makes me so proud to be a trans person in the trans community, and so excited about our future and excited about trans lives and what we can be and do, and just so excited to see that play out over generation and generation. The young trans people in our country especially are under a lot of attack, but they will be as awesome as everybody else is too, and it's going to be so fun to watch that happen and to have a part in trans education.
I love that, Gavin. I really appreciate the joy that you bring to this. Tori and I talk a lot about that, and Tori is a great beacon of joy, I think, when she's doing her advocacy for the community as well. So, and for folks who didn't get a chance to see the video at the beginning of this session, check it out at hrc.org/trans, but it's part of our campaign to really shine a light on trans joy and resilience. So going to you, Tori, next. Actually, we in your work, you do a lot to sort of educate others, and we might have folks watching today who are interested in being better advocates, better allies. What are some tips then that you would give folks who are seeking to be better advocates for trans folks? Oh, we can't hear you, Tori. Are you muted?
And now you should be able to hear me. So I'm listening and taking notes of how this is moving. So I'm adjusting some of my answers based on what you all are saying. And one of the things that I heard, Laura, heard you describe cultural humility, though you didn't use those words. And so what we have to do as folks who are providing it as educators, as human beings, as whatever you are, however you describe yourself, we really have to take much a tone and be intentional about cultural humility. And two points about cultural humility. One is the commitment to lifelong learning, which I heard you say, Laura. That's one of the foundations of cultural humility. And another is critical self-reflection. And what that means is when we've screwed up, correct it and make it up. And we as humans, we screw up all the time. Language is fluid and regional. Conversation is fluid and regional. And the way that we describe people and situations and lifestyles and life situations and even gender identity for some people can also be fluid. So we have to understand that nothing is stayed and very few things that stay the same. And I'm going to do something that might be a little dangerous, but I actually want to use a small bit of a response in the last couple of seconds to respond a little to one of the chat comments that I think was intended to be a negative. And that is, so when we're fighting for trans rights, what we're saying is that every person should have rights to express themselves as freely and openly as they want to. And so if you're a person who is queer, then if trans folks are getting ahead, then that means we open doors and we make way for fighting for trans folks, that we are allowing queer folks to be as queer and happy and gay and joyous as they want to be. But in turn, that also means for folks who aren't queer. If you are a person who is not queer, who doesn't consider yourself part of the rainbow family, you get to live as freely and openly and honestly as well. And that opinions are just that they're your opinions. They're not professional. They're simply your opinions. And all of us are entitled to those. The difference is when we use our personal opinions to determine what public policy should be. And that is wrong. Because all of us in some way or I talk a lot with my hands, so that might scare people when you see my hands on camera. But we all, as human beings, we all are in some form of transition at all times. As living creatures, if you're not transitioning, then you're dead. It's just as simple. A flower starts as a seed and it transitions through its life. And as soon as it stops growing, it starts dying. And it's the same for a tree, and the same for a dog, and the same for a cat, and certainly the same for human beings. And so we have to transition our thoughts as well to ensure that we're not discluding people from the conversation. So as a trans person, I welcome all cisgender folks to fight alongside us for trans freedom. As a heterosexual person, I welcome all queer people to come along in the journey to fight with us, because we're going to fight with you. And so it's important that we don't allow a small majority who is very, very loud to further divide us, and instead realize that we're much stronger when we work together, because the same forces that are there to divide us are the same forces that will devour us individually if we allow it to do so.
Thank you so much, Tori. Jessica, you know, I think we've talked about the joint lesson plan being one way to help bring trans rights education to the classroom, but can you explain a little bit more what else can be done to support educators and students wanting to bring this type of social emotional learning to the classroom? And how can fellow students and really everybody who's part of this watching today be better advocates and allies for the LGBTQ community?
Well, my answer is in connection with Tori's answer. First, I feel we need to understand that we are not experts in someone else's life or experience. Second, we all need to learn how to listen. Listen to understand and not to reply back, but listen with an empathetic ear, listen with understanding. And that's something that many of us struggle because we don't listen. We just want to answer or reply back. But now we need to like listen with understanding and with an open mind and with an empathetic ear. Listening to what the trans community is saying and making sure that we are centering trans people and not ourselves. Listening in allyship means more than just hearing what a trans individual says. And when they try to say something that, oh, this is affecting me, or that there's something is wrong. Listening in allyship means that there is a continuous conversation happening and action being taken about things that may affect trans, such as the language, having bathrooms accessible, creating an environment that feels comfortable for trans people to vocalize their issues, as everyone has different needs. An important part of social emotional learning is self-reflecting, as Tori mentioned. When people reflect on their own social emotional learning, they gain a deeper understanding and have insight into their own strengths and areas for improvement. To be better advocates, we need to constantly self-reflect and listen to others. Don't be afraid to admit when you don't know something. It's better to admit that you don't know something than to make assumptions or say something that may be incorrect or hurt somebody else. We should seek resources that will help us learn. And remember that being an ally is a sustained and persistent pattern of action. We need to be more than allies. We need to be a community that comes together and fight together. In Stony Brook, we call it co-conspirators because we feel like sometimes ally is just like on the side, but no, we want to be in together and fight together. Thank you. And adding cultural humility all the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Really appreciate that. I think this is coming to our last question. I so valued this opportunity, you all. Laura, can you tell us a little bit? You know, this just came out this week. How are teachers and students reacting to the plan?
Yeah, thank you for asking. We are so excited with the positive feedback we've received so far. We've been able to talk to a number of our teachers, including one of our teachers from New York, who said, you know, they really liked the lesson explored the resilience of trans peoples and the multiplicity of our identities. And they pulled out some of the same things that Jessica and Tori did. That there's really those critical thinking and the discussion of real life topics and evaluation. They also liked that there was multimedia aspects, which are perfect for the digital learning space. Our lesson has also gone international. One of our educators in Spain had a chance to look it over and participate with it. And they said that they thought it would be really great in the Spanish context and thinking about how to open their students' hearts and minds to have these meaningful conversations and increase awareness for LGBTQ issues in their country. We've also had an opportunity to share it with some of our student groups. Our youth advisory board was able to take a look, and they said that they thought that they were just really inspired by how folks in future generations would be built upon the acceptance and equality that these kinds of lessons promote. And our RFK Young leaders said that they really liked the content and the teaching methods that were used, and that they wish that something had been available for them like this when they were young. So while we know that this isn't the end all be all, and we know that the lesson is just the start of some of these conversations, we're really hopeful that it can be one step in moving us forward to protecting human rights and helping folks to live as their authentic selves.
Thank you so much, Laura. And thank you all, everybody. I think this lesson plan is maybe one start, but you know, from education to then setting up systems of accountability that really can keep us all true to moving that progress forward is the next step. And I really appreciate everybody's effort and co-conspirator status in this fight. Make sure that you visit welcomingschools.org for more classroom resources and find the lesson plan at rfkhumanrights.org/TDOV. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Really appreciated this discussion and appreciate all of you.